Part 2. Number 4. Story, characters, and spoilers. As mentioned, this game is some of the best storytelling and characters ever released in a video game. When discussing the nature of storytelling in video gaming, however, I think it's worth understanding some history. Most games up to this point have pretty simplistic stories. Even other critically acclaimed games have pretty poor character development or are always constrained by their technical limitations. Don't get me wrong, I love a lot of those old games like Earthbound or Zelda, or even more modern examples like Mass Effect or GTA. But these games are often focused more on the mechanics and not on the drama. It's about the adventure, the discovery, or the strategy. Never before has there been such a strong focus on the development of plotting from a character perspective. So what the fuck does drama even mean? Well, that's sort of a difficult subject, one that's still debated. Generally speaking, though, drama is about character choices and character actions within the context of a plot. Typically, a drama is about the character motivations and the choices they make. Unlike an action movie or a romantic comedy, the outcome isn't really what matters. In a drama, we care about the human condition of the people on screen. We project ourselves into the scene and feel their internal conflicts or their challenges. Classic works go back thousands of years to Plato and all the rest. For most, however, drama is typified by things like Shakespeare, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet. In more modern iterations, examples of good drama could be something like Frost-Nixon or Good Will Hunting. The things that these have in common is the establishment of characters, actions, and motives within a world. As mentioned, world building is essential for creating a good story. If the characters are acting in a vacuum, then we can feel that. In extreme cases, it even feels like the story is being made up on the spot, or is even written backwards in time. So what I'm ultimately getting at here is the necessity of character development and world building as two sides of the same coin. Where world building is the establishment of an environment, rules, and context, characters need a place in the world and they also must be consistent with it. While I could go through this with examples of film, I think we should get into this game. So this is accomplished through rules about what one can and cannot do in the world. For instance, one must be careful about making noise, leading to crouching and silent movement. Additionally, people need to wear a gas mask to avoid the spores. Indeed, even the notion of spores is a crucial piece of the world. One must be careful about traps, the use of shivs, ammo, bricks, and firebombs. There is even extensive rules of characterization established. We come to find out how each character will respond in certain situations.
I forgot to leave that stupid robot on his grave. What should I do with it?
Ellie.
What? I want to talk about it.
No.
Why not?
How many times do we need to go over this? Things happen, and we move on.
It's just...
That's enough.
On the character side of the spectrum, we have Joel, a guy that wears flannel, could cut down a tree with a glance, and probably modeled for paper towels at some point. Now Joel's character is pretty simple. He's a blue-collar worker that doesn't get along very well. He's a classic man's man who is soft-spoken, rugged, emotionally detached, and doesn't hesitate about the right thing to do. Joel is a nobody in the old world. He was probably a day laborer who worked in construction. He was easily replaced and feared for the loss of his job frequently.
He's the contractor, okay? I can't lose this job. I understand.
However, in the new world, Joel is the key to survival. He is strong, silent, resourceful, and has expertise in surviving in a world that doesn't care about you. His character is pretty simple. He loses his daughter in the first night after she's murdered by a soldier. He becomes emotionally withdrawn, but still likes to put his arm around people. Sometimes to protect them. Our second character is Ellie. She's a precocious girl who is immune to the cordyceps fungus. She was bitten but hasn't developed any symptoms. The revolutionary group of the Fireflies want to use the mutation to find a vaccine. Out west, they have a camp and he's going to take Ellie. In the context of the story, however, she is coming of age in this crazy world. She grew up in a military academy, snuck out to visit the mall, and is generally a pretty mature person. Over the course of the game, however, she grows up and learns to fight as well. As someone who's precocious, however, she's already willing to take the initiative, is already really expressive, generous, and pretty vulnerable and thus easy to like. Like Joel, however, she's lost someone that she cared about. This, of course, brings us to our plot. And the basic idea is, of course, that Joel has a redemption while Ellie comes of age. Number 5. Two sides of the same coin. If the first side of the coin is building a world that's engaging and interesting, the second side is ensuring that the actions and behaviors of the characters are as well. In the same way that a world needs to be built linearly up to its conclusion, characters need to be developed as well. And like real life, film uses gradual character development to increase the audience's interest. So at the beginning, Ellie is portrayed as this awkward third wheel, and people basically talk to each other as if she wasn't even there. As time goes on, however, they build some relationships, and Tess sacrifices herself so that Ellie and Joel can escape. Through the journey, we begin to learn about them. We learn that Ellie can be aggressive towards Bill, that she's willing to take responsibility and can actually succeed. She's a tough, but also vulnerable person.
I'm whistling!
Oh, good. Something else you can do.
In Pittsburgh, they get into some tight situations, and Ellie starts to grow up. She uses a gun and even saves Joel's life with it. Eventually, they meet some new people, and Ellie really likes having a friend like Sam. Unfortunately, it's not to last, and we even learn their different styles of dealing with it. The relationship between Joel and Ellie grows even further as they reach Tommytown, and Joel still wants to pawn her off. Ellie gets upset and runs away. It's really strong from a character perspective how these people have actually come to care about each other, and Joel ends up deciding to take Ellie to Colorado himself. Of course, Colorado is a bust as well, and you see the characters in their lowest point. In terms of a 3-part dramatic structure, this is the end of the second act, and truly where the game gets interesting. For those not aware of this structure, let's take a detour to Star Wars to look at how this is actually done. So since most people have seen the original movies, we can simply say that each movie functions as its own act. The first act is basically to set everything up. It establishes characters, desires, the conflicts between the hero and the enemy, and so forth. This is, of course, A New Hope and sets up Luke, the Rebellion, the Empire, and Darth Vader. The second act is when the characters start to take action against the problem, but haven't fully developed the skills yet on how to fight them. This is accomplished perfectly by Empire and the training of Luke Skywalker and his premature attempt to confront Vader. The second act is usually when all the characters are at their lowest points and thus usually the most emotionally involving. The third act is basically the resolution and the fulfillment of the character arc established in the previous part. For those that understand screenwriting and the nature of plotting, this is all pretty obvious. But even though The Last of Us doesn't follow this structure to the letter, it follows the overall characteristics fairly well. If we were to understand our plot in terms of a 3-act structure, we'd realize that the first act is everything up through Billstown. The start of Pittsburgh is when the second act arguably starts and then finishes when Joel gets hurt. If we realize that the arc is more about them as characters, then it actually fits the 3-act structure pretty well. By the beginning of the third act, which is basically the education and training of Ellie, we see the resolution of the love between them coming full circle. You see, it's at this point of the horse chase that Ellie really feels betrayed by Joel, and thus Joel begins to feel guilty about Ellie's situation and thus decides to take her the rest of the way. It's at this point that they embark on the next segment, almost prepared for the events to come. From a similar perspective, one could argue that the second act is completed when Ellie confronts David, and thus fully completes the relationship between Joel and Ellie. Arguably, it is the situation where they are at their lowest points and begin to fight back. Definitely, it's one of the more emotionally moving pieces in the entire game. Between the two, I'm not sure it really matters, though. At the end of the day, it's the situation with David and the injury of Joel that really makes a compelling story, since all of the themes that are established are mere foreshadows of the concepts that we're to revisit when we reach Salt Lake, including manipulation, greed, and guilt.
I'm still waiting for my turn.
Number 6. Guilt and survival. So on the grand thematic level, this game is about the emotional survival in a period of transition. As can be said with most quality storytelling, there are themes that overshadow every action and line of dialogue. In this game, the theme is that of survival and guilt. As humans, we feel for our fellow man, and when others die and we don't, we feel conflicted. Joel loses his daughter and struggles with accepting that she died for him. I think this is why I like this game so much. Most other games and movies about zombies really just get into the mechanics of the world. It's about food, survival, and the return to a simpler time. Sure, some of them have some human elements of romance or losing loved ones, but it's never anything abstract. So by any objective analysis, this game is about this guilt and pain of survival. In this respect, it's not deep in a mechanical sense, but in an emotional one.
You have no idea what loss is.
Everyone I have cared for has either died or left me. Everyone fucking except for you.
And it's this aspect of survival that's very realistic. We know that we would feel bad with conflicting emotions during a time of turmoil. Even modern soldiers suffer from this when they lose people in war. So common is this that the notion of survivor's guilt is subsumed in PTSD. In short, this game is good because it actually addresses the drama and motivational conflict of real life.
You keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you said about the Fireflies is true.
So with all that said, let's get into this progression. So the trip is originally to be very short. Apparently the Fireflies have a base out west and a means of finding a cure. Oops, maybe not. So the plan is to stay in Boston and merely deliver Ellie to the Capitol building. But as governments often disappoint, the Fireflies are already dead and Tess has been bitten. Joel proceeds to take Ellie across the country himself. Along the way, they run into some interesting characters, some douchebags, and even some infected. They have some pretty close calls, but ultimately come to care about each other. Joel comes to love Ellie and begins to project the loss of his daughter onto her. When it comes time to deliver Ellie to the Fireflies, Joel finds out that the procedure isn't just a pap smear and realizes that she will die to find the cure. Joel, of course, isn't going to let that happen and starts to do what he does best. So he saves her and takes her back to Tommytown. Ultimately, the story is well developed and the characters are well established. The use of guilt as a deeper level is really what gives the story its power. It reckons back to basic philosophical contradictions about whether it's okay to sacrifice a single person to save many.
The needs of the many outweigh
the needs of the few.
or the one.
It's classic drama, really, and gets the audience involved since it invokes the potential sacrifice of characters we love and care about. Often in media, we might get the sense that characters are immortal.
We're gonna get pulverized out here.
Look, we got 4 or 5 of the main characters on this ship. I think we'll be fine.
This can be distracting since the outcome becomes predictable. Thus, in a game like this, we're involved with the decisions of the characters and feel justified taking certain actions. Of course, we can't choose whether we'd kill the surgeon or let Ellie sacrifice herself, although we're never told if she was really willing. But it forces us to think about the deeper moral quandary. Ultimately, it's a good story because it forces us to feel the situation. So after he saves her and takes her back to the car, Ellie half-heartedly asks about the cure and Joel lies. She seems to know he's lying, but it ultimately serves to alleviate her guilt. Now, while all of this is good, I think the real power comes from this notion of guilt. I think my favorite part in the whole game was when Joel shoots Marlene in the face. While I can understand her motivations to save the world, that she was probably under pressure from the other Fireflies to find the cure, despite her friendship with her mom, but it was just so good. You see, she seems to use the logic that the ends justify the means.
Here's a chance to save us. All of us. This is what we were after. What you were after.
Now, before we get too far here, I want to say something about the nature of guilt and consent. When I first played this game, I had a spirited discussion with my friend about Ellie's supposed sacrifice. He argued that if Ellie wanted to give her life for the salvation of humanity, she should be allowed to. I disagreed, and I'll explain why, since I think a lot of viewers might share that view. Now, ignoring the fact that this girl isn't even 18 and hasn't experienced anything of life and thus isn't qualified to make a decision of that magnitude yet, there is the problem of guilt to account for. The issue is that Ellie has not been given an independent choice. You see, when we think of consent and the decision to do something, the choice must be independent of our human needs. Imagine if someone points a gun at your head. It's basically the same thing, except that the gun is merely emotional. You see, our brains force us to make certain decisions to keep us alive. I doubt that most people could hold their breath long enough to commit suicide, or even choke themselves out with their own hands. You see, the brain takes over and puts a stop to these things. It's basic self-preservation. Similarly, if we get desperate enough for food, we're likely to steal or even kill for it, even if we weren't a criminal before. You see, it's not an issue of free will. If someone is making you do something, then it's not really consent, even if you do rationalize it. In the world of academia, they have a term for this fallacy. It's called the fundamental attribution error. It basically says that people are wrong if they assume that actions are taken because of personality rather than context. What this means for us is that Ellie's sacrifice has little to do with her desire to be a savior and more to do with people's expectations of her. By being so young, inexperienced, and influenced by others around her, she feels constantly guilty for having survived when other people are dying. Like when Riley didn't leave her behind, or when Tess sacrificed herself for her and Joel, or when she even had to kill all of these people. When Joel gives her an out in Jackson, she even rationalizes the entire journey that
It can't be for nothing.
Ellie would realize that if she didn't sacrifice herself, she would then have to live her entire life feeling guilty about not having saved the human race. The problem is that this is an unfair choice to Ellie. Sure, she might be the only means of finding a cure, but that doesn't mean that she should feel guilty for wanting to live like the rest of us. This is why this is so good. It highlights the contradiction of a savior and the problems of guilt. It perfectly explores the contradictions of making such an altruistic decision by breaking it down into the fallacy that it ultimately is. You see, Ellie is ultimately being manipulated by Marlene through her guilt to ensure that Ellie's consciousness is okay with dying.
It's what she'd want.
The problem is that this manipulation is almost exactly the same situation as David. The only difference is that David isn't going to use her to save the entire human race. He's probably just going to use her as his newest pet. At the end of the day, Ellie is still being manipulated, only through a different angle. Instead of her body, Marlene is merely seeking her brain, and not even her intellect. Now, remembering that all these people have died for her, and that she can't give consent neither because of her age nor because of her emotional condition, I'd like to add further analysis with the giraffe scene. Now, for those of you who are convinced that Ellie should still sacrifice herself, I've got one final point to make, as I anticipated all of the above on my first playthrough. This scene is the establishing shot of my hometown of Salt Lake City. So basically, Ellie and Joel find the perfect vantage point over an open field, and Ellie spots some giraffes. Anyone familiar with Utah climate knows that giraffes are pretty far from home. But the lush green trees, the music, and the ultimately inspiring scene implied one thing to me. Life goes on. And it's worth noting that this is what they were actually going for. When I wrote this review for the first time, I hadn't seen the Grounded documentary yet. But the programmer actually says that exact thing.
Life goes on.
Put me on the team, coach. I'm ready. So anyways, no matter how bad things are, and no matter how dysfunctional Mother Nature appears to be on the surface, life is about change and survival. It's not about reversion, it's about continuance. And it will change and survive under even extreme circumstances. Thus I thought to myself, well, even if this Ellie thing doesn't work out, things will ultimately work out. It was a real game-changing experience for me because up to this point I was in favor of the scientific approach. I wasn't sure if Ellie would need to die in order to create the vaccine, but I still thought it was an avenue worth exploring. But it really stood out to me that putting too much faith in the old world, namely the world of science, calculations, and the cruel use of life, was a big problem. As someone who favors science generally, this was a good moment to reflect upon the cost of technology and progress. Joel was strong enough to save this one sacrificial lamb, but are we as a culture? Now, the fact that one disagrees doesn't make a damn bit of difference. As long as you have an opinion and are involved with the decisions taken, the outcomes, and all the rest, it's successful. You see, in most of the time in video games, these sorts of morally difficult decisions and character motivations are done in superficial ways, if not omitted entirely. Clearly this isn't the case here, and they really hit the nail on the head. I mean, we could keep talking for hours and even get into all the stuff about issues with Riley, Ellie's depression with the deer, Joel's big lie, or even the fact that Marlene doesn't have much of a choice either, but I'm just going to leave it all at that. We really have enough to think about for the time being. So I guess in summation, I really like this game because it's a good example of drama. It actually gets you involved with the story and the decision making on a visceral level. I know that we've mentioned the viscerality part before, but not only does it engage you on that level, but it also has heart and intellect. It's not just a mindless action game. So it's probably well known that games are not normally known for their drama. This is due to the structure of most games. Usually, you're the good guy. You're Zelda, or Mario, or Batman. You are the hero and will do what's always right. You'll save the princess and punish the bad guys. This game really takes a step forward, giving us a world where simple black and white is replaced by nuance and moral ambiguity. Even games like Red Dead or GTA that often involve a morally ambiguous character are still rooted in some notion of being a good person. With the exception of Trevor, most protagonists are not crazed sociopaths, and thus while are technically criminals, are often trying to live somewhat decent lives. The advent of moral ambiguity and the nature of these emotional choices is really a coming of age in video gaming. We've certainly come a long way from the puzzle games of Pac-Man and Tetris, but I hope we've permanently turned over a new leaf in terms of quality. So to recap on good storytelling, there's a few things worth mentioning. Number 1, two sides of the same coin. So as mentioned above, the trick to making a good story is to balance the world with the characters. This is probably obvious for most people, but good movies have more going on in subtext than they do in the plotline. This applies whether it's in characters and motivations, or the world and the conflicts therein. You see, we like a deeper meaning to things, and thus simple movies can be fun, but they also aren't as engaging. Thus, if we think of a story as composed of a background and a foreground, then the background should be deeper than the foreground. This means that world building needs to appear deeper than one can easily understand on the first viewing. You need to have things that are subtly engaging or otherwise complex. The subtle and the mundane is not worth looking at. Watching paint dry and grass grow is not very engaging. Number 2, the lowest common denominator. Good stories are those that engage on a universal human level. While we might initially think that the lowest common denominator is a bad thing, and from a certain perspective it is, it's worth noting, however, that things that become too complex or tricky can be equally hard to understand. The trick is to not get bogged down with too much simplicity. You see, all stories have a fundamental language. Thus, while a story can be simple and thus appeal to a lot of people, it also doesn't need to be obtuse. The trick is making it understandable and relatable. Number 3, avoiding distractions. This is a key problem in video games, but is common in most medias. The trick to making a good story is avoiding the pitfalls that draws the audience away from the main narrative. The trick is to avoid world-breaking ideas and concepts, or anything that might shatter their suspension of disbelief. If you're constantly muddling with the controls, or trying to play around a specific glitch, it gets distracting and takes us out of the moment. Thus, whether it's having characters act irrationally, or being distracted by visual glitches, the avoidance of these will help an audience stay focused.
Well, that's as much as I wrote, so I hope this explains a little more about why The Last of Us is the turning over of a new leaf for the industry. Thanks for watching.